Hi, if you build web apps, I want to show you something. It's a technique, and I guarantee it's something you've never heard of before because it's a technique that I developed over about 20 years. Now, you might know me for teaching JavaScript, and I've been a developer for 25 years, but for much of that time, I've also been a user experience designer. I've built design systems, I've worked on many web apps, and I've run hundreds, if not thousands, of usability tests where you watch real world users, not developers, try to use the software that we give them. And in that time, doing both of those jobs, I've developed a technique that I find time after time, app after app, works every time to improve the usability of a web application. And it's very dev friendly. You don't have to be a designer to be able to use it. I call it normal UI, the term normal being inspired by database normalization. But here we're talking about user interfaces, a normalized user interface and a denormalized user interface. Well, what does that mean? Why? Well, in this video, I'm going to introduce you to the technique. We'll look at a concrete example and talk about how it also has technical benefits. So not just the user experience side, the design side, but also the dev side. All right, let's get into it. First of all, what's the problem that we have? Well, I call it the design dilemma. There are two aspects to this design dilemma that I see. One is a lot of dev teams have a very small number of devs, maybe even just one dev or two, working on a web app, B2B, SaaS, e-commerce, internet apps, whatever the case is that we're talking about. And they don't have access to a designer. So what do? Well, you use UI component libraries, you buy templates, and you do the best you can. And you might be able to produce a very good-looking web app with controls that work well and are accessible. And that's fantastic. That's something you should do. But buying UI component libraries, buying templates, using them does not guarantee that our web apps have good usability. Because good usability is about more than that. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. The second aspect of the design dilemma is teams that do have access to a designer, but either they don't let the designer do more than just make their apps look pretty, or the designer themselves, maybe they came from an artistic background, trying to find work, they got into web design, so they know how to make things look good, but they don't really know much about usability. That's pretty common too. This technique is especially useful in either of those situations, where there's no designer or a team where the designer is more about graphics and less about usability. So the idea is to help you with that design dilemma. Now, what do we mean by normal UI, normalization, interface normalization? Well, we compare it to database normalization. And this was really the inspiration for me because over many years, I've done tons of work in relational databases, optimizing relational databases. So when we think about a denormalized table, a relation in a database, it has a lot of information, unnecessarily repeated. But one way to think about it is that it isn't very focused. It doesn't try to just do one thing well. It's doing a lot of things. Like in this table's case, it's orders, but it's also repeating all the customer address information and the product names. It requires more effort to read in the sense that you need to kind of pick out what you're looking for because there's so much there. On the other hand, when we normalize a database and we split up into different tables, like a customer table and a product table and an orders table and an orders details table, and each of those is referencing the other, each table is now very finely focused on a particular type of thing. So there are more tables, but they're smaller, more refined, more focused. I found that actually makes a great metaphor for what we're going to talk about when it comes to user interfaces. With this technique, the idea here is that you think about the sequence of actions that a user takes in the application. We could even draw it out. When you're on a particular screen, the user clicks a button, which takes them either to a different screen or to a new state of the same screen. I call that a frame. So a user clicks on an accordion, it opens. The click was an action. They were an initial screen, and now the screen is in a new state. The accordion is open, and they click it again, and the accordion closes, new state. And you can just draw that out. Now, what I do is when there's a screen, I make a square. And when it's just a new state, or what I call a frame, make a circle. So here we have, let's imagine possible sequences where a user is staying on one screen. That's the square. And there's lots of actions they can take, but they're always just looking at new states of the screen. Maybe a panel opens, maybe an error appears, whatever the case is. I refer to this as a denormalized workflow. As the user clicks through actions, they stay on one screen. The screen itself, and that could be either a page or even a modal in a web application, something where the users just focus on the controls within that screen. Well, that screen contains a lot of possible states, and the user just stays there. That's a denormalized interface. Now, a normalized interface is one where we have various screens that the user visits as they accomplish the task. So instead of an accordion opening and closing, maybe they click on the question in an FAQ and they're taken to an answer page, which would be a new screen. So again, I do squares for screens and circles for frames or states. So on the right-hand side here, this would be a normalized workflow where the user is accomplishing somehow the same task, but we take them to more screens rather than just having lots of states on one screen. Now, there's a bunch of benefits to either case. Sometimes you want a denormalized workflow, and sometimes you want a normalized workflow. Sometimes you want to keep the user on one screen and let the screen do lots of things, and sometimes you want to spread that workflow out, move the user across screens, let each screen become more focused. Whereas a denormalized interface, the screen is less focused on one particular type of task. Let's give a concrete example where normalization helps. Let's think about what I call dangerous workflows. That's a workflow, a task that's being accomplished in your web app where it does something that the user can't easily undo and is probably pretty impactful. For example, a classic one would be a button that sends a mass email. Now, that's very impactful, and you can't undo it once it's done. The recommendation is for dangerous workflows, you should normalize them. So what does that look like? Well, let's suppose we had a screen where we had a bunch of invoices in our web app that the user is managing, and they are going to have some kind of feature where they click a button and it mass emails people who haven't finished paying off their invoices a payment reminder. We might consider this a dangerous workflow. Once it's done, you can't undo it. If the user does it by accident, it might cause some kind of problem for the business or get them in trouble with their manager. We really want to remove the possibility of user error, or at least reduce that possibility within this dangerous workflow. Now, what we might initially code or think about doing is simply having a pop-up that says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And then they click through, and then a toast message on the screen that says, send X number of emails, or just emails sent. But this is a dangerous workflow. So if we think about drawing that workflow, I'd say, well, I'm on the invoices page. That's a square. I click send reminder. That's a pop-up, but it's just a state. I'm still on the same screen. So that's a circle. And then I click OK. And I'm taken to another circle, another state of the page. The confirm pop-up closes and a toast appears. This is a denormalized workflow. Few screens, lots of states. So what would it look like if I normalized it? Well, this technique isn't about giving you design patterns. It's just about a way of thinking. So if I was to move these moments, the response to each action, to more screens and less states, what happens? Well, let's say I click the button and instead of getting a pop-up saying, are you sure? Okay, and then a toast, I instead am taken to a new screen. Let's say a page that says, send payment reminder email. You're about to send this number. A warning, this can't be undone. 2 big buttons. Yes or no, do you want to do this? And what's the benefits? Well, I've reduced the cognitive load of the user. There's not as much for them to worry about or be confused on the page. The page is very focused, much like our normalized table was very focused on one thing. So I can optimize this screen, this step in the workflow, to make it as usable as possible, to draw attention to the user, to help prevent them do things by accident. And then maybe I click yes, and I'm taken to a confirmation page that lets me download a report or see an error summary or something like that. Now, if I was to draw the normalized version, it would be the page. I click send reminder. And then what happens? Well, not a pop-up. Instead, I'm going to a reminder page, now a square. And then I click yes, send this. And maybe I'm taken to a confirmation page that says complete and well done. And these are now more squares than circles, more screens than states. So this is a very normalized workflow. This is the basic idea behind normal UI. Do you want a denormalized workflow or a normalized workflow? There are circumstances and situations that I recommend where one is better than the other. And I find that when you make those adjustments, things happen like happier users, happier stakeholders, customers that come back, customers willing to pay for your app, and also less instances where you're getting some kind of frantic phone call because a user made a mistake and they're trying to get the dev team to help fix the consequences of that mistake. So I find that this has broad benefits and it has technical benefits. What are some of the technical benefits? Well, when you think about just a normalized interface, and sometimes a denormalized one is better, a normalized interface tends to be more accessible out of the box because when you have more space per screen, you tend to be able to use native web controls, things that are built into the browser. When you try to stuff everything onto one screen, you tend to have to make more custom controls. And that's more problematic with accessibility and it requires more JavaScript code, more bugs, more errors, more technical debt, more design debt. Also, I find that the workflow maps to the app skeleton. So if you're using a JavaScript framework, every square is a route. And every circle is going to be some kind of show hide situation in the template. So just thinking through this idea of normalized or denormalized workflows can actually let you set up your app ahead of time before you even fill in how every page is going to work. Finally, I find it's a way for dev and UX to be able to talk to each other. It's a common vocabulary for discussing how we want a particular feature, a particular sequence of actions, clicks, taps, whatever the case is in the app to work. And once you have that down, then the design team is thinking perhaps about the usability, but the dev team can also think about things like bundle size, lazy loading. For example, if you know something's in a separate screen, then you can lazy load that route. Or if you know something's a circle, you're going to be able to make a component and lazy load that component at times if that improves your performance. And there's lots of other benefits as well, just that come from everyone on the team being in this kind of mindset and having a framework to be able to talk about these things. The last thing I want to mention is that this isn't a guarantee that your web app will be easy to use. Easy to use involves a lot of things: usability testing, good user research, but it definitely helps improve the usability of your application. If you think through denormalized versus normalized for this particular thing that needs to be accomplished in the app, do I need more screens or should it all be on one screen, where I find more screens for certain circumstances, which help the user through a process, less screens for certain circumstances. For example, when we want the user to be a power user, they need to be more efficient. They use it all the time. Frequency of use is one of the metrics, for example, to decide between the two. You end up with easier to use web applications. And the easier to use a web application is, the more successful it is. I've seen that over and over again for, like I said, a couple of decades. The idea here is to introduce you to this concept and give you a concrete example that you could apply in your applications. So look at the particular sequence of actions, particular sequence of clicks for any task in a web app you're working on, and look at, is it denormalized or normalized? Am I moving across various screens, being pages or modals? Or am I staying on one screen and showing lots of things that appear and disappear on the page, lots of states that the page can be in? And that tells you if you have a denormalized or a normalized workflow. If this is a dangerous workflow, I recommend that you normalize it. Now, if you want to learn more, you can go to normalui.com because I wrote a book. It's $9.99 USD. I wanted it to be as accessible as possible to everyone. It's a very fast read, and you can start implementing Normal UI in your apps, in your team. And I'm also bundling it with a video series that's upcoming as of the recording of this video, where I will go through a lot of common web app features and show how denormalization and normalization can help in those cases. And I'm in the video forums answering questions personally. So I wanted to show you this technique. Like I said, if you Google around, you're not going to find it anywhere. This is my technique, but I can say with great confidence that it has helped every time. And I find it's helpful to designers and makes sense to developers. And so that's it. And again, you can go to normalui.com. You can download the first 4 chapters of the book for free in PDF format. And I hope this introduction has helped you to think about how you're flowing your users through your web app for different tasks and help you improve the usability of your web apps, because usable web apps are successful web apps. And I hope you have success.